The Daily Code Snippet. This past week, we continued our discussion of forms. We covered some input types and elements that were not discussed previously that are for special use cases, and we discussed client-side form validation. The text area element is used when you need a text response from a user that is longer than a single line of text, which is the limitation for the text input type. The columns and rows attributes are used to define the area of text when the browser first loads the element, and again, this can be done using CSS instead. The number for the rows attribute is the number of rows, but it's the number of characters per row for the columns attribute. Like other input elements, it works with the label element in the same way. Although we have discussed several of the input types that create buttons, there is also a button element. The input element is an empty element. Input type equals image is used to load a custom image. You use the source attribute to tell the browser where to find the image. We also use the alt attribute to describe the contents of our button for someone using an assistive device. An embedded style displays our image button at an appropriate size. Our next example is a reset button. A user can enter a response in our text input field. The reset button will clear it, and finally we see the submit input. Although it is grayed out because the button is disabled and not clickable because we use the disabled attribute. This is how the code would be different using a button element. If you do not specify the button type, the browser will assume it is a submit button, so it is best practice to declare the type of button. This element was created to give developers more flexibility in the design of their buttons. Whatever is between the button opening tag and the button closing tag becomes part of our button, an image, longer text, etc. The button type equals button option gives the developer flexibility on the function of the button. It is meant to be coupled with code, typically JavaScript, to define its function. If not defined, it has no default and will be clickable but do nothing. The reset button works the same as a reset input. The submit button is more customized. The button element is appropriate when you want to create a custom function or when you may want to create a custom grouping of elements to make up your button, for which the limitations of an input element are too constraining. But button is not supported by older browsers, and the input element has more cross-browser compatibility. Next, we went over additional elements. The select element is used for a drop-down list. Note, our code does not list all the states. The option element is used here to present the different options from which the users can choose. To pre-select an option that is not the first item, add the selected attribute to that option. The opt group element is used with the select element to group some of the option elements together. There are two attributes that work with the opt group element, disabled and label. The disabled attribute makes none of the options within a grouping selectable. The label attribute is used to name a group of options. We see that we have option elements within different opt groups, and these opt groups group some options with similar characteristics together under a label. The opt group with the disabled attribute will be grayed out, so none of those options are selectable to the user. Grouping elements helps make a long drop-down list manageable. The field set element is used to group related form inputs, and legend is to add the caption for that grouping. By using the field set element, we have grouped the inputs in a single box that the legend input lets the user know that we are seeking contact information. The output element is for when the inputs are used for a calculation that is determined by a script. This code allows the user to adjust the value of input A using a range slider that can adjust in increments of 1 and has a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 10. The value to input B can be adjusted using a number input. These two numbers are multiplied together. Client-side form validation is a way that the contents of a form can be examined to prevent errors from being sent to the server. Validation also prevents malicious actors from trying to take advantage of form inputs. In the past, JavaScript was required, but with HTML5, there are now some built-in validation that does not require JavaScript, but JavaScript is still needed for complex validation. Adding the required attribute to any input field makes the response mandatory, so if the user attempts to leave the field blank, the user will receive a message to fill out this field prior to submission. Other attributes include min length, max length, and pattern. Min length and max length limit the required minimum and maximum length of an element. Pattern tells the browser what types of responses are appropriate. If the user's response does not match what is expected, an error will be generated. When using the password input type, the characters a user enters are masked. If you try to submit without entering a response, the required attribute generates an error. If you enter a password without enough characters to meet the min length, you generate an error. The max length prevents entering over 12 characters. And finally, if you enter a password with numbers and letters against what is required, you will generate an error. In addition, we have seen HTML5 validation in use through newer input types. For example, how input type equals email knows when a user does not enter an appropriate response following an expected format. name@domainname.com. Presented by Designers Learn Code.